Thank you for coming. I'm Rick Wilson, the director of Scientia, and I'd like to thank you for attending today's Scientia lecture on the general topic of facts. The topic promises to be timely. We cover this throughout the year, exciting and contentious. In the political realm, we've watched partisans bicker over what constitutes a fact, or for that matter, perhaps an alternative fact. In the scientific realm, we've seen conflict over which facts support conclusions about climate change. And today we're lucky to have a speaker who can address that. Scientia's colloquium series looks at facts from multiple perspectives. I might want to note today, our speaker talking on climate change is opting to do this in a carbon neutral fashion. She'll be appearing virtually. And I've asked Elaine Howard-Eklund, a Scientia member, to introduce today's speaker. Elaine is the Herbert S. Autry Chair in Social Sciences, Professor of Sociology, and founding director of the Religion and Public Life program at Rice University, where she's also a Rice Scholar in the Baker Institute for Public Policy. My pleasure to introduce Elaine, who will introduce her speaker.
Thank you, Rick. It's a real pleasure to be here and to introduce to you today Katharine Hayhoe, who is an atmospheric scientist whose research focuses on developing and applying high-resolution climate projections to understand what climate change means for people in the natural environment. She wears many hats. Among some of them, she is a professor and director of the Climate Change Science Center at Texas Tech University. She has a bachelor's in science and physics from the University of Toronto and an MS and PhD in atmospheric science from the University of Illinois. She's a Canadian, and she brings much to the other America, the United States, as a professor at Texas Tech. So we're very excited to have her and all that she's contributed to our nation, for sure. She served as the lead author for the second and third U.S. National Climate Assessments. She's conducted climate change assessments for a broad cross-section of organizations, cities, and regions that include Boston Logan Airport for the state of California. Academically, her work has resulted in over 120 peer-reviewed publications that evaluate global climate model performance, develop and compare downscaling approaches, and quantify the impacts of climate change on cities, states, ecosystems, and other sectors over the coming century. Katharine has received the National Center for Science Education's Friend of the Planet Award, the American Geophysical Union's Climate Communication Prize, and the Sierra Club's Distinguished Service Award. She's currently serving as lead author for the upcoming 4th National Climate Assessment and producing the 2nd season of her PBS Digital Studios short series, Global Weirding: Climate, Politics, and Religion. She's been recognized by Time magazine as one of the top 100 most influential people in the world, by Foreign Policy as one of the top 100 global thinkers, and by Fortune as one of the 50 world's greatest leaders. She served on panels for the National Academy of Science, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and many other professional organizations devoted to understanding and communicating climate change. Her work creates opportunity for thinking deeply and for understanding someone who really defies social categories. She also talks to churches and other religious organizations about the connection between religion and science, and particularly what faith organizations can do to have an impact, a positive impact on rectifying climate change. She is also someone who is a phenomenal communicator. It's my privilege to call her a friend and colleague. We've been connected in broader projects. And really her work, I think, is at the heart of what Scientia is about, really understanding and communicating science and science themes to the broader public. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce to you Katharine Hayhoe. Thank you for being with us.
that, and I want to thank you for showing up. Because this is unusual. Normally you like to see a real live human being, and I assure you I am real and I am live. I'm just not physically present in Houston. But as you know, talking about climate change, we recognize that there's a certain irony to traveling around the world telling people that we need to reduce our carbon emissions. And so a couple of years ago, when I measured my carbon footprint, and if you haven't done that yet, I recommend it, it's very helpful. If you go to the next slide, you can see one of the calculators I use, the Cool Network calculator. When you use a carbon calculator to calculate your footprint, always an interesting exercise, usually you end up with something surprising. When I did mine, this is what I found. If you go to the pie chart, I found that the largest part of my personal carbon footprint, which is very similar to many academics, was flying. I drive a car that gets great mileage. It's an electric gas hybrid. We eat low down the food chain. I hang up my clothes to dry. But flying was my Achilles heel. So what did I do about that? I figured, first of all, when someone asks me to speak, I'm going to say, are you willing to consider a video presentation? And for that, again, I thank you enormously. Because I love the fact that you're in Houston, I'm at the other end of Texas, but we are talking to each other. I can even see your faces. Yes, I can even see you in the back row. This is a good camera. And I can feel like I'm here with you, and hopefully you feel the same with me. This is just a view of my office here at Texas Tech. So we're going to talk today about facts, and as we do so, I think it's important to keep in mind that whatever facts we agree with, as well as facts we might not agree with, they affect us personally, and they affect our personal decisions. So even what we might study very academically, so to speak, has implications for how we live our lives. So with that said, let's go ahead and begin. We're going to talk about facts, and I'm very honored to be able to talk about facts because this is something that preoccupies me a great deal today. Let me give you a few examples of why I'm so preoccupied with the idea of facts when it comes to talking climate. Next slide. We have seen in the last few years alone quotes like this, and I've just picked a couple of highlights here. As you know, we could give an entire presentation of these quotes. For everyone who thinks it's warming, I can find someone who isn't. Next quote. There are a substantial number of scientists who have manipulated the data so that they will have dollars rolling into their projects. Next quote. These global warming studies are a bunch of snake oil science. Next. And climate change is not a science, it is a religion. The proof of that, all we have to do is go to the internet, where we see, next slide, the Church of Climatology, and someone has even photoshopped my head onto fire. So, when we live in a world like this, where it seems even the basic facts are up for grabs, how can we talk about climate? I would say almost every day, certainly multiple times a week, the most frequent question I get is the following. Next slide. And this is one of our global weirding videos. If you haven't checked out our global weirding videos, please do. You can find them on YouTube. They're super short, 5 to 7 minutes each, and they address a lot of common questions. This one is the most cited video. It addresses the question, could you just explain the facts to my neighbor, father-in-law, colleague, college friend, elected representative, politician? Because if you explain the facts, I'm sure they'll get it. Unfortunately, the answer to that is, next slide, they won't. And for many of us who operate on the idea of if we just explain information, if we study it, and if we subject it to the peer review process and the scientific method, it actually is truth. For many of us, when we're leaving a discussion with someone, where we have presented facts and data and information, and even peer-reviewed science, and it didn't change their minds at all, we're kind of left looking a little bit like this. Next slide. pace myself, and I probably could. So, let me just digress for a minute, though. Are there facts when it comes to climate? Is it just opinion, or are there facts? There absolutely are facts. So let's spend about 10 minutes, first of all, talking about what are the facts. Here we go. Fact number 1. Next slide. Fact number 1 is that climate is changing. Now, we're not talking about the fact that it's cold one day or hot the next. Next slide. We often confuse weather with climate. Weather is what happens in a certain place at a certain time. It's like a single tree. It's that hot day or that cold day or that crazy blizzard or hurricane or heavy rainfall event. That's weather. We're talking about climate. Next slide. Climate is like a forest. Climate is the long-term average of weather over at least 20 to 30 years. So when we talk about climate changing, we're not talking about how there's a hot day now and a cold day later. We're talking about long-term, over 20 to 30 years, are things changing? And when we look in Texas, we see that every single season in Texas has been warming since the 1950s. At the same time, though, people say, hang on, though, it's cold outside. Where's global warming now? But the reality is saying it's cold outside, therefore the entire planet can't be warming over multi-decadal timescales is kind of like saying, next slide, I'm on the Titanic and it can't be sinking because my end just went 200 feet up in the air. The reality is that when we look at our world, next slide, our global average temperature measured by thousands of thermometers around the world, it goes up and down from year to year, that's weather. But over climate timescales, 20 to 30 years, it is going steadily up. It isn't even just about thermometers. If we look around the world, next slide, we see evidence of a warming planet all around. Record-breaking heat waves, warmer oceans powering stronger hurricanes, faster evaporation increasing the rate of heavy precipitation, and making our droughts stronger and longer. If we look around the entire world, and we look for all of the independent lines of evidence there are telling us the planet's warming, you know how many of those there are? Next slide. 26,500. Trees flowering earlier in the year, species moving poleward, migration patterns being disrupted, glaciers melting, sea levels rising. The world is getting warmer. That is a fact. Next slide. What's the second fact? The second fact we know, and this may surprise people, we actually know that it really is us this time. How do we know that? How are we so sure? It's because we've looked at all the natural suspects first to see if they could be responsible. And we have systematically gone down the list of all the natural reasons why climate has changed in the past, and we've looked to see if they could be causing the warming. And when we do that, we see that every single natural reason that absolutely has caused climate to change in the past, every natural reason has an alibi. I'll give you a few of the top ones, the top 3, so to speak. Here's number 1. Could it be the sun? We get just about all of our energy from the sun. We get a tiny little bit from the Earth's core, but we get the vast majority from the sun. And in the past, the sun's energy has gone up, we've gotten warmer. The sun's energy has gone down, we've gotten cooler. So if we were getting warmer right now, the sun's energy would have to be going up. But when we actually look at what's happening, next slide, this is the temperature of the Earth over the past 150 years or so. This is the temperature of the Earth going up, and next slide, this is the temperature of, this is the energy from the sun. It's been going down. So if we were being controlled by the sun right now, we'd be getting cooler, not warmer, and that is a fact. Next slide. Could it be natural cycles? This is the most frequent but what about question. And so the first episode of our Global Weirding series this year asked the question, isn't it just a natural cycle? So if you want to see this short part of the presentation again in a bit more detail with some cute cartoons, check out the Global Weirding It's Just a Natural Cycle video. This is the #1 reason people use, especially farmers and producers, when you say it's getting warmer, they say, oh, it's just a natural cycle. Well, what is a natural cycle? El Nino is one that we're very familiar with, and there's many more natural cycles. But what these natural cycles do is they move heat around the Earth system. They don't create heat or destroy it, they just move it around. So in other words, if the atmosphere is getting warmer, it's because heat's being moved somewhere else to make it warmer, usually from the ocean. If the atmosphere is getting cooler, it's because heat's going from the atmosphere into somewhere else. So instead of just looking at air temperature, we have to look at the heat content of the whole system. And if the heat content of the air is going up, and the heat content of the ocean is going down, then clearly our warming is a natural cycle. Let's look at that and see. It's kind of like, the way I think of natural cycles is like a teeter-totter or a seesaw. So in other words, you have a certain amount of heat, and sometimes more of it goes here, and sometimes more of it goes over here. So let's look at the actual data. Go ahead. This is the change in the heat content of the climate system. Push the button one more time. The green is the change in the heat content of the land and the atmosphere and ice, all put together. And the blue is the change in the heat content of the ocean. If we were warming due to a natural cycle, you would have the green going one way, and then you would have the blue going the other way. But they're both going up. That's how we know it can't be a natural cycle, because the whole climate system is gaining heat. It doesn't work. Next slide. There's one more type of natural cycle, though, that operates outside the Earth system. And those are the natural cycles that bring the ice ages. They're really cool. We talked about them in a little bit more detail in that video. They were discovered by a concrete engineer who couldn't work on concrete engineering anymore during World War I because it was such a political topic. Yes, concrete engineering used to be very political during World War I. So he decided he was going to figure out why we have the ice ages and the warm periods that we're in today. And he figured out that over time, the Earth's axis of rotation precesses like a top, and also over time, the Earth's orbit becomes more circular and then more elliptical. And these changes change the way the sun's energy falls on the Earth, and they're what drive the ice ages and the warm periods like we're in right now. So could we be just getting warmer after the last ice age? Next slide. This is looking at our Earth's temperature, the red line there, over the last 6,000 years or so. What we see is, rather than getting warmer, in fact our warming peaked after the last ice age about 8,000 years ago, and we've been getting cooler. And you can do the calculations on where we are in those orbital cycles, and according to those calculations, we should be heading into another ice age within the next 1,500 years. Now, not tomorrow, not next year, but within the next 1,500 years, we should have been heading into the next ice age. But we are not anymore. Push the button one more time. Now we are warming, and you can see from this figure how unusual the warming is today, right? Temperature is not the only thing here. I included carbon dioxide, a heat-trapping gas, because that's where we're going to go next. Only now, when we've looked at the natural suspects, can we start to say, could it be something else? And when we ask, could it be something else, we don't have far to look, because if you look at the Earth's history, when did things start to get weird? A couple hundred years ago, right? What else happened a couple of hundred years ago? Next slide. The Industrial Revolution. When we figured out how to dig massive amounts of coal and gas and oil out of the ground and burn it. We know how much of the stuff we've been producing because we've kept good records. If you push the next slide, we can see we've been producing a lot more of this stuff. Why do we care about it? We care about it because carbon dioxide acts like a blanket around our Earth. Natural levels of carbon dioxide already keep our planet over 60 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than we would be otherwise. We would be a frozen ball of ice if it weren't for our natural blanket of carbon dioxide. But what happens if you're sleeping at night, like my grandma used to do, and she sneaks in when you're sleeping and she puts an extra blanket on you that you didn't need? You wake up sweating, saying, "Grandma, I didn't need this blanket." That's what we're doing to our planet. By digging up and burning massive amounts of coal and gas and oil, we are wrapping an extra blanket around our planet that it did not need. And that extra blanket is trapping more of the Earth's heat inside the climate system that would otherwise escape to space, and that is what is causing us to warm. Now, at this point, you may be saying, "Oh, well, this is some pretty newfangled science. I mean, you've only been studying this for, 10, 15 years? It's too early to be sure. We need to study this for much longer." How long have we known that our planet had a natural blanket of heat-trapping gases? We've known since Fourier's work in the 1820s. How long have we known that burning coal and gas and oil produced carbon dioxide, which would wrap an extra blanket around the planet? John Tyndall in the 1850s discovered that. That's right, over 160, almost 170 years ago. How long have we known how much the world would warm if we doubled or tripled levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Arrhenius, in between his daytime job of winning a Nobel Prize in physical chemistry, on the weekends decided he was going to build the first climate model by hand, using the physics and the chemistry that they knew in the 1800s. By 1895, he had calculated how much the world would warm and how much more the Arctic would warm, because the Arctic warms faster than the rest of the world because all that shiny white ice melts, meaning it absorbs even more of the sun's energy as it warms. He calculated, quite correctly, how much the world would warm as a result of human emissions in 1895. And then Guy Callendar last was a British engineer who wrote all around the world to collect temperature data from thermometers and weather stations all around the world, and who in 1938 published the first paper to actually show that the world was indeed warming as a result of burning fossil fuels. 1938. That is how long we've known about this. So, go ahead, next slide. What are the facts? Climate is changing, it is us, and the third important fact is, it's bad. Now, this is a fact that a lot of us don't really get. And when I say a lot of us, I don't mean people in Houston anymore. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But a lot of us don't really get the idea that climate change can affect us personally, because if we look at books or movies or, textbooks about climate change, what's the number one picture that you see on the cover? It's usually white, furry, sitting on a piece of melting ice, looking sad. Go ahead, next slide. It is a polar bear. Now, being Canadian, I love polar bears as much as the next Canadian. And I respect them even more because they are some powerful predators. I have been nose to nose with a polar bear, and that was an experience that you have to respect for the rest of your life. There was something in between us, yes. But if it's only about the polar bear, why don't we block off the whole northern half of Canada and just make that into a polar bear sanctuary? If that's the only impact that we care about, surely there's easier ways to fix the problem, right? The reality is we care about a changing climate. Because, next slide, after the polar bear, we're next. And maybe that's what the polar bear is trying to tell the man there. Why do we humans care so much about a changing climate? Next slide. We built our civilization on an assumption that we don't often think about. It's the assumption that we can have, hot and cold and wet and dry. But we have built our cities, our water systems, our energy systems, our agriculture, our economy, on the assumption that it all averages out in the end. What happens, next slide, if that assumption is no longer true? And even worse, what happens, next slide, if the variability is changing too? I'll tell you what happens. What happens is you get multiple 500-year events in less than 5 years. Because what we use to define the 500-year event is the past. And the past is no longer valid if things are changing. The way I think of it is this. Next slide. Out where we live in West Texas, our roads are very straight out in West Texas. And so you could be driving a good long ways on an interstate highway, staying not just on the highway, but in your lane, driving along looking in the rearview mirror. Why? Now, I don't recommend it, but why would it work? It would work because the past is a perfect predictor of the future. On a straight road, where you were a minute ago, and 5 minutes ago, and even 10 minutes ago, is a perfect predictor of where you'll be a minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes in the future, right? So in the same way, if climate is stable, where you were in the past is a perfect predictor of where you'll be in the future. But what happens if there's a curve in the road? Next slide. And in I-27, which is what that arrow was, there's a giant curve right before you get to Plainview, Texas. A giant curve with concrete grain silos on the curve. What happens if you were driving down the road looking in the rearview mirror? You're going to end up somewhere you didn't plan to be. Planning for the future based on the past is like driving down the road looking in the rearview mirror. It works great when the road is straight and when climate is stable. But when there's a curve in the road and when climate is changing, it doesn't work so well anymore because we are planning for conditions that are very different than what we're going to see in the future. That, in a nutshell, is why humans care about a changing climate. Next slide. We care about it because this assumption of stationarity, this assumption of the straight road, has gone into our water planning, it has gone into our food planning, it has gone into national defense and security planning, it has gone into economic planning. And these are all reports I'm showing you here, pictures of reports that highlight how a changing climate impacts each one of these sectors. The bottom line is this, next slide. We care about a changing climate because it takes the risks we already face today and it exacerbates them. That is why we care about a changing climate. And if you're interested in how the risks change in the places where we live, next slide, a great resource. The Years of Living Dangerously is a TV show. They actually won an Emmy for Best Documentary. And they go around to different places, mainly in the US, a few abroad, talking about how the impacts are here today and how they're affecting real people. So at this point, next slide. At this point you may be saying, could you please explain these facts? It's real, it's us, it's bad. Because they have to get it, right? Unfortunately, though, this idea that if we explain the facts, people get it, depends on an assumption. And here's the assumption. Next slide. The assumption is what's known as the deficit model. The idea that people are willing and available to process information if we just clearly explain it to them. And so if people don't have the right opinions, or if they don't know the right facts, they just haven't been told the facts. Well, here's why I love social science so much. It's because social science studies how we as humans interact with information. And so social science can ask questions like, does this work? And here's one study that asks that. Next slide. Dan Kahane is the first author of this study that was done 5 years ago now. And here's what this study said. He said, public apathy over climate change is often attributed to a deficit in comprehension. People don't know enough to avoid being misled. Next slide. We conducted a study and we found no support. People with the highest degree of science literacy were not the most concerned. Rather, they were the ones among whom cultural polarization was greatest. In other words, next slide, we are not blank slates waiting for the correct facts to be written on our blank slate. No, next slide. Dan went on to conclude that this result suggests public division over climate change doesn't come from lack of comprehension of the science, but it comes from personal interest people have in hanging with their tribe. Who we associate with, who we identify with, is the #1 predictor of our opinions about climate change. And today, we live in a very different society than we did 25 years ago. Here's the proof. Next slide. Back in 1994, the Pew Foundation started to look at political polarization. And when they did, people were quite close. You got Democrats, you got Republicans. No nice normal distributions, the medians are pretty close. And then, over time, look at what happened. Next slide, 2011. Following slide, 2015. And then they asked this question again, only of people who are politically active, and it gets even worse. Next slide. We're at the point now where if you are not yet married, the #1 predictor of who you will marry is simply how close they are to you on the political spectrum. Is that horrifying or what? What does this have to do with climate change? Next slide. It has everything to do with climate change because the #1 predictor of what we think about climate change, the #1 predictor, is not how much we know about the science, it's not how educated we are, it is simply where we fall on the political spectrum. That is the #1 predictor. And I have evidence. Next slide. This is work by Larry Hamilton at the University of New Hampshire. He asked people, do you think climate change is happening now, caused mainly by human activities? And then he divided their answers out in 2 ways. #1, he divided it out by people's level of education. From high school, some college, college graduate, to postgraduate education. And then he divided out a second way by politics. Democrat, Independent, Republican, and Conservative Republican or Tea Party. Self-identified. He would ask people how they personally identified. What happened? You can see, right? People became more divided the more educated they were. Now, some of you must be sitting here saying, but surely the last, I don't know if there's anybody there called Shirley, but I'm not talking to you. Surely the last 8 weeks have put this to rest, haven't they? Because, next slide, the last 8 weeks have been unprecedented. It isn't only what happened in Houston. What happened with Harvey was followed by Irma, which was followed by Maria. And we know, next slide, we know that we're not expecting to see any more frequent hurricanes in a warmer world. Some seasons we get a lot, like this year. Some seasons we get hardly any, like last year. But we know that we expect hurricanes to be stronger because they get their energy from warm ocean water. We know that hurricanes are intensifying faster than they used to be 25 years ago. We know that precipitation rates associated with hurricanes are higher in a warmer world because water evaporates faster. So you might say, surely now people understand. Next slide. Or you might say, but look at what's happening in California in the West. It happened in Oregon and Washington State earlier. We know that wildfires are not more frequent. Most of them are due to human ignition. But we do know that the area burned by wildfires is increasing as the world gets hotter and drier. So you might say, surely at this point, this is enough to change people's minds. There we go, yes. I forgot that I actually had the wildfires in there. Wildfires are burning greater and greater areas, and the season is much longer. And so next slide, surely we are all in the same boat as the Prime Minister of Dominica that said, to deny climate change is to deny the truth that we have just lived. And make no mistake, for many people, this is the turning point to say, something's going on. Here in West Texas, our turning point for many people came in 2011. Between 2010 and 2012, there was a massive shift in public opinion in West Texas from saying climate is not changing to saying, yes, it might actually be changing because this drought was unprecedented. Not willing to necessarily go beyond a natural cycle, but willing to say something's different. So yes, for many people who personally lived through this, it is absolutely a turning point. But for the people who are watching this on TV, is this a turning point? Well, Larry Hamilton to the rescue. He's actually asked this question and just published the results last week. Here we go. Next slide. This just came out last week. So post-Harvey, post-Maria, post-Irma. Does recent extreme weather add to the evidence of climate change? And again, Larry divides people's answers out by how they self-identify politically. People who are liberal or moderate liberals, between about 80 to 90% of people say yes. Next slide. People who are in the middle, they're 50-50. They're 50-50 on this issue after the last 8 weeks. And last slide. Isn't that amazing? And Larry has more information. For example, they had a record warm winter in his state 2 years ago. And in February, he asked people if they thought it was a record warm winter. And people's answers on whether the winter that they themselves lived through was warm depended on how they voted. It is insane, and that is why the facts do not matter in determining our opinions. If you go to the next slide, the next slide shows a poll that was conducted a year ago, asking people, depending on who they were going to vote for, what they thought about a changing climate, and you can see that the difference is enormous. In fact, if you ranked up all the issues that people disagreed with, depending on who they were going to vote on, climate change is one of the top issues that people are most divided on. So it's no surprise that when we have a conversation about climate change, next slide, the conversation looks something like this. And Susie the scientist shows up with, next slide, Susie the scientist shows up with all her scientific reports and data and facts and figures. And what does Calvin respond with? Calvin responds with his identity, because it is about his tribe and what his cultural community believes and says. And so rather than building a bridge between us, next slide, the conversation ends up digging a trench, and it usually ends up finishing off something like this. Next slide. There we go. I tried to find a picture of two heads exploding, but I couldn't. So if anybody has a picture of that, please do send it to me. So at this point, we've kind of hit rock bottom, right? At this point, we're saying, okay, there's solid facts, yet the facts don't matter. In fact, they even make the conversation worse. How the heck do we talk about this issue? In our last 10 minutes, I have the answer. And it begins by understanding the root of the divide. Go to the next slide. The real problem is not rejection of science. Now, I know that all the objections we hear sound sciencey. It's just a natural cycle. It's happened before. Science is too uncertain. Many of the objections also sound religious-y. God wouldn't let this happen. The Earth's going to end anyways. But if we spend more than 2 or 3 minutes talking about this with somebody who has sciencey or religiously sounding objections, within 2 or 3 minutes, the conversation, I guarantee you, I've had hundreds of these conversations. Within 2 or 3 minutes, the conversation will take an abrupt right-hand turn into talking about how they don't like the solutions. I don't want, and these are real quotes, I don't want the government setting my thermostat. I don't want the government destroying the economy. I don't want them to take away my truck. I don't want the government to interfere with my personal liberties. I don't want us to lose economic competitiveness with China. Have you heard any of these before? These are the real problems. And one of my favorite people, next slide, Gail and Carey works for the National Association of Evangelicals. Yes, evangelicals. They have a book out about how caring about climate change is caring about the poor. And Galen said something I completely agree with. He said many so-called evangelicals oppose actions to slow climate change Not on a religious basis, but politically because they believe the government wants to take away their freedom. And I have one example for you here. Next slide. The senator from Oklahoma is one of the most vocal opponents of climate change. He's even written a book about how climate change is the greatest hoax ever perpetuated. You can find it on Amazon. He writes all the time about how, the arrogance to assume that man could change something as huge as our planet when God's in control. Yet 5 years ago, in a very revealing interview with Rachel Maddow, he said this. He said, "Do you realize I was actually on your side when I was chairing that Senate Environment Committee when I first heard about it? I was on your side to win." To win. I was on your side until, next slide. I was on your side until I found out how much it would cost. So here's the interesting thing though. Are we really that divided on solutions? Go to the next slide. This is a Pew study done last year that looked at how far apart people are. Now we already know on the climate science, people are very far apart politically. Again, this is from last year, so it was just before the election. But, hit the button again, look at this. When you ask people about, do you support hybrid vehicles? Do you support personal lifestyle choices that reduce your carbon footprint? Do you like fuel efficiency standards or even corporate tax incentives for efficiency? What about international targets like the Paris Agreement or restrictions on power plant emissions? What do you notice? Those bars are narrower. People agree more on the solutions than they do on the science. And you know what? That is totally fine with me. Because we need to fix this problem. I don't care why you want to fix this problem, as long as we agree we want to fix it. Let me show you some evidence. Next slide. Is there evidence that we agree on the solutions? I think there is, and I'm going to show you some. First we'll look at the science again. Next slide. These are some awesome maps from the Yale Climate Opinion poll. You can find it online. They even have maps for Canada. And they divide their results out by state, by county, and even by congressional district. So they ask people, do you think global warming is caused by humans? Anything that's blue is less than 50%. Anything that's orange is more than 50%. And the country's kind of patchy. So you might look at this and you might say, we're never going to fix this problem. I mean, we're just, we're 50-50, the facts don't work, we can never change people's minds. Hit the next button. Do you agree that global warming will harm people? They asked about developing countries, they asked about your neighbors, they asked about plants and animals. Everybody says yes. It's orange just about everywhere. So people might not think it's human caused, but they think it's harmful. Okay, hit the next button. Do you support requiring utilities to produce 20% of your electricity from renewables? Yes. Next one. Do you support setting strict CO2 limits? Yes. Now, why would you support setting strict CO2 limits if you don't think it's warming the planet? I don't know. I don't care. And then the last one is a no-brainer, especially for us here in Texas. The last one is, do you support funding research into renewable energy? It is a heck yes. It's a dark red everywhere. So the amazing thing is we actually agree about solutions much more than we agree about the science. So in our last 5 minutes here, I'm going to talk about how we can talk about this issue. Here we go. Ready? There's 4 steps. The first step is not the science. It's to figure out what we have in common that we care about. The second step is not the science. It's connecting what we care about to the issue of climate change. The third step is explaining. If we have to do any explaining, that's where we do it. And then the last step is talking solutions, feeling like we can actually do something to fix this problem. Let me give you some concrete examples in each one of these categories. First one. What values do we share? I used to fish a lot. Do you fish or hunt or bird or hike? Do you ski? Are you a parent who cares about the future of your child? Next slide. Do you belong to a faith community? Do you belong to the Rotary Club? I don't belong to the Rotary Club, but a couple of years ago I was asked to speak to the club here in Lubbock. And as I was walking in, I saw their banner, and I thought to myself, oh my goodness, this is the perfect way to think about climate change. So they had the lunch first. So I helped myself to my chicken and my green beans and my roll, and then I sat there and I redid my presentation following the 4-way test. Is it the truth? Yes. Is it fair? No. Would it build goodwill to address it? Yes. Would it be beneficial to all to fix it? Absolutely. I went through the 4-way test, and at the end of the presentation, I still remember this older businessman came up to me. And you know Lubbock, Texas, we're very conservative here. This older businessman came up to me and he said, kind of with this look on his face like, he said, you know, I'm really not on board with this whole thing, but it passed the 4-way test. Kind of in the tone of, well, I have no choice now. You get my point. We first of all bonded over a shared respect for the 4-way test, because even though I'm not a Rotarian, I absolutely think this is a great test. Then I connected the test to climate change, and he was done. Over 85% of people in the US and around the world belong to some type of faith tradition. And every single major faith tradition has at its core the idea of stewardship or responsibility for the planet and care for people who are less fortunate than us. And at the bottom line, next slide, at the bottom line, we just have a shared sense of place. We want the place where we live to be able to support us and our family and our community. Because, next slide, we can't just exist floating around in space. We need a healthy home. And that is why I believe that just about every single person on the planet who is sane already has all the values they need to care about a changing planet. We just have to listen to them and get to know them enough to figure out what they are, and then connect the dots. So how do we connect the dots? Next slide. How do we connect the dots between what we both care about, whether it's the city we live in, Houston, whether it's our children, whether it's our faith, or the Rotary Club, or the Boy Scouts, or whatever group? How do we connect the dots? I'll give you a couple of examples. Next slide. Connect the dots between climate change and availability of snow for skiing. Connect the dots between bird abundances and health and climate change. Connect the dots between our water resources. Connect the dots between livable, safe cities and climate change. I mean, the list can go on and on of all the dots that we can connect. Next slide. Do we care about those less fortunate than us? Climate change disproportionately affects them. Next slide. Do we care about our neighbor, as the Texas translation of the Bible says? Climate change affects other people. Then and only then do we need to do any explaining. Next slide. We can explain that, yes, it's real, it's us, scientists agree. We can explain, next slide, that it matters to us if we live in the east because of rising sea levels and stronger coastal storms. Next slide. If we live in the west, we care about it because we have beetles eating millions of acres of forest, burning even larger areas because they're full of dry trees. Next slide. We care about it if we live in the north because of what used to be permanently frozen ground that is crumbling under our feet. Next slide. We care about it if we live in the global south because of the increased risk of heavy precipitation and flood events. Next slide. We care about it because climate change exacerbates the risks we already face today. It doesn't create hurricanes, but it makes them stronger. It doesn't create droughts, but it makes them longer and more intense. It increases our risk of heavy rainfall events. It takes the risks we already face today and it amps them up, it puts them on steroids. And if you look at the next figure, next slide, of all the billion-plus weather and climate disasters that have happened since 1980, the most number have happened where? Texas. Why? Because we get it all. We get blizzards, ice storms, tornadoes, hurricanes, haboobs, heat waves, droughts, floods. We get pretty much everything. And climate change is exacerbating many of those naturally occurring extremes. That's why we care. Final set of slides. So how can we work together to fix this problem? One of the biggest things we can do, and I mean this is your last map here, one of the biggest things we can do is we can talk about it because, next slide, when the Yale program asked people, do you talk about this issue, most people said, no, I don't talk about it. Why? Because I don't want to end up like Calvin and Susie. But what can you talk about? I'm going to give you a couple of talking points to talk about. I'm going to challenge you to use one of these talking points sometime this week. Here we go. What can we talk about? First slide. We can talk about how it matters to us. It is amping up the weather risks we face, and boy did we see that this year. We can talk about that from the heart because it affected us personally. Next slide. We can talk about amazing solutions, like they're building floating villages in the Netherlands. So when sea level rises 3 feet, they just get 3 more feet of anchor chain. Or we're being more efficient with our water use out here in West Texas. Or, next slide, they're powering sub-Saharan Africa with pay-as-you-go solar. And we have over 25,000 jobs in the wind industry here in Texas. Next slide. We have the town of Georgetown that went 100% clean energy to save money. We have Fort Hood that's saving taxpayers $168 million by going with wind and solar over natural gas. Every spring we break records for the most wind power ever generated. This year it was 23% of our electricity on the ERCOT grid in the first quarter of the year was wind. And we can even talk about China next slide. China isn't building a new coal-fired power plant a day now, they're shutting down the equivalent of a new coal-fired power plant a day. They lead the world in wind and solar energy, and next slide, they're putting $360 billion into clean energy in the next 2 years. We can also talk, next slide, about personal things that we can do, and this is one of our global weirding videos. I'm just one person, what can I do? We can also talk about things communities are doing. Like next slide, a church that volunteered its roof as a solar garden for the community, or a small college in upstate New York that's only 1,200 students, yet they have the largest solar array of any educational institution in upstate New York. We can talk about organizations, next slide, like Citizens Climate Lobby that engage with politicians on every side of the aisle. Their Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus now has 58 members, half Republican, half Democrat, because you can't join unless you have a partner from the other side. How can we talk about changing climate? Next slide. We talk about it by listening to people, getting to know them, bonding over shared values, connecting them to climate. If we need to do any explaining, do some explaining then, but find ways that we can act together. Because the bottom line is this, final slide. As Jane Goodall said just a few years ago, it's only when our clever brain that's stuffed full of all our facts and figures and data, it's only when our clever brain and our human heart work together in harmony that we can achieve our full potential. Thank you.
Katharine, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to hear you. Thank you. So we're going to have time for a little bit of question and answer. How much do we have? How much time?
10, 15.
About 10 or 15 minutes. So if we'd like to have your question recorded and also you use the mic so that everyone can hear you, and I will point you out and Rick will run to you. So just raise your hand.
While you're doing that, let me also tell you that we release a new episode of Global Weirding every other week on Facebook and YouTube. And in the week in between, I do a Facebook Live Q&A. And my next Facebook Live Q&A is coming up tomorrow night on my Facebook page, and we get through, I don't know, about 200 questions and comments in about 35 or 40 minutes.
Wow.
So if you're into Facebook at all, check out my Facebook page, which is just my name, and join us for our Q&A there online. That way you don't have to actually ask a question in person, you can just type it into your computer and you can print.
So Catherine, this is Rick Wilson. I do have a question for you. It looks as if I'm a political scientist and study American politics as well, and I think it's going to be tough to inoculate us against either being a Democrat or a Republican to partially cure the problem. So do you have additional suggestions for what we might do for people who maybe get their information, which reinforces their beliefs from extreme media sources, both real and fake? You take the pick, which one's which?
Yes. So the important thing to realize, I think, is that if we really can't find something to connect with, to bond with someone over, then we're not going to be an effective communicator with that person or that group. So, for example, I was speaking up in Canada a couple of years ago in a conservative part of the country, and after my talk at a Christian college, a fellow scientist came up to me and said, "You know, I've been trying to reach out to churches in our area, and I just can't get my foot in the door." He said, "What's your advice for connecting with those churches?" And I said, "Well, my best advice is to connect with the denomination that you attend. You know, so what type of church are you affiliated with?" And he said, "Oh, I'm an atheist." So I said, "Well, in that case, I wouldn't start with churches. I would start with a group of people who you connect with and who actually share something with, whether it's, again, skiing or birding, whether it's a parent group, whether it's a community group. Find something that you agree on. And then, rather than talking the science, which we saw the science is the most politically polarized part of it, rather than talking the science, talk the impacts and solutions. And so I'm not a solution person, I'm a climate scientist, but I've had to educate myself very much, and I've spent a lot of time doing this, educating myself on libertarian solutions, free market solutions, economic solutions, business solutions, military solutions, so that I can converse with people who have those principles and values over solutions. Because as a climate scientist, I'm pretty solution agnostic. I'm like, look, any solution at this point, people, is better than no solution. And so I'm happy to talk libertarian solutions with a libertarian, and for them to go in thinking, wow, we actually might be able to fix this according to my principles. That's my best advice.
Hi, Catherine. First of all, thank you for sticking by your guns on not flying down here. I was invited to do a keynote in North Texas, and I said, let's do it electronically, and I got dropped. So, and also thanks to Rice for doing this. I have a physics degree, and when I first started talking about climate science, I used to do lots of graphs and data and that sort of stuff, and I, like you pointed out, found out that really wasn't working very well. And the most recent workshop I put together actually was exploring Buddhism and climate change, what the tenets of Buddhism have to say that could be useful in this issue. It had some people that were climate activists and practicing Buddhists come and talk about how that intersects with them. I am very aware and have been very appreciative of you coming from your evangelical Christian background. And I'm wondering, do you recommend a source sort of like, I used Professor David Lloyd talking at Dartmouth about his Buddhist practice to a non-Buddhist audience. Do you have a source you would recommend for exploring what Christianity has to say about this issue that would be presented to a primarily Christian audience that would work well?
Sure, that's a great question. That's one of the topics I often post on my Facebook page, trying to provide resources to people to dig deeper into certain issues. I think it really depends on what perspective people are coming from, because the Christian faith is very broad, as you know. So you have the Pope's encyclical that came out 1.5 years ago, which is a wonderful statement of why, from a Catholic perspective, and really from a human perspective, we care about a changing planet. The Orthodox Church, the Patriarch of the Orthodox Church, has statements. From the Protestant part, there's a difference, I think, between Reformed theology that believes that the earth is getting better and better, and the more traditional evangelical theology that believes that it's going away. And so there's a lot about caring for the earth and stewarding the earth, but then there's also a lot about caring for the poor and caring for the vulnerable and caring for those who are being negatively impacted today as a result of this issue, and how we as Christians care for and love those who are poor and those who are, the widows and the poor of the world. So there's a lot of, all that to say, there's a lot of different resources. One of my favorites is written by Mitch Hescox and Paul Douglas. Paul Douglas is a weather forecaster and a Republican. Mitch Hescox is a former coal miner, now an evangelical minister. And they wrote a book together that was just published last year talking about caring for creation. And I like it because it really lays out from their own very unique perspectives. I mean, a coal miner, an evangelical minister, and a Republican. It lays out from their perspectives why they really care. There's also the Evangelical Environmental Network that actually has a great resources page because there's many other excellent books. Cal DeWitt is an ecologist who's been writing about creation care issues for decades, and he's written a number of books kind of uniting the idea of stewardship and ecology. And then there's many other excellent books too. So the resources page from the Evangelical Environmental Network, but if you want something recent, looking for the evangelical perspective, I would go with Mitch Hescox and Paul Douglas's book.
Hi, my name is Chris. I'm a PhD student in the history department here, and what I study is comparative international development with democratization and economic progress as it relates to people's civic, religious, faith, tradition, worldview, whether they're religious or not. Just what is the, different regional variants of Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Islam, Protestantism, different brands of Protestantism, what their assumptions are for how they look at the world, and then what they think about human nature and collaboration. And since America, I don't know the exact date on it, I was wondering if you could comment, since America has, my understanding is that it has a particularly large, it is a bit of an outlier with the number of people who doubt the science compared to other OECD member states. As an evangelical myself, I struggle with, how much responsibility does our worldview have to do with that, or elements within how we've interacted with science compared to other mainline Protestant groups, or even, changes in Catholicism over time from Galileo to, say, the Second Vatican Council embracing, evolution. And where does that put us in terms of our strategy and responsibility in explaining why America is an outlier and maybe bringing it back to regression to the mean?
Mm-hmm. Wow, that is a question that is very near and dear to my heart. I wish we could just sit down and have coffee for about an hour. I grew up in a developing country myself, and so, the differences are just absolutely stark. When I went to the Paris Climate Conference, seeing all of the countries there, the vast majority of countries in the world were there in Paris, not to agree to limit their carbon emissions because they didn't have any. They were there to say, what are we going to do? Our people are already dying, our crops are already failing. How are we going to survive this crisis that we didn't contribute to? After coming home from Paris, I couldn't even hardly talk to people for weeks afterwards without just the overwhelming frustration of the attitude of, plugging your ears, closing your eyes, and saying, I'm just going to ignore the suffering of the world. It's just amazing. And so I would say, in short, I think for many people, their politics is writing their statement of faith. Their politics are guiding their theology. And I even see this working with development organizations myself. So just to give you some concrete examples, I have not worked at all with any large, solely US-based organizations. I've worked with organizations like Tear Fund and Care International that are based in the UK. I've worked with World Vision, that's an international organization, but like Samaritan's Purse, for example, absolutely closed doors, no desire to talk about changing climate. I also work with smaller organizations, so like Plant with Purpose is one of my favorite smaller organizations that do ecological restoration and climate resilience as well. They're a faith-based organization based in the US. I think that it's a tragedy the way that we have let our ideology overwhelm the fact that our faith is centered around the idea of loving and caring for other people and sharing God's love with them. And so that to me really gets at the heart of why this is a hard issue. And, you know, for those of you, you might not, you know, share our faith, or you might not feel the same way, but there are things in your heart that you care passionately about, and many of the things that you care passionately about are being affected by climate change, whether it's just simple justice and fairness, whether it's a sense of community or place, whether it's just wanting a healthy and safe world to live in and to bring your children up in. There are things we all care passionately about, and that passion connects directly to the issue of a changing climate. And if we can tap that, if we can connect those dots, we don't have to change people's hearts. We don't even have to change people's minds. All we have to do is connect the dots between the values that people already have in their hearts and the issue of changing climate. That sounds a lot easier, doesn't it?
Well, I'd like to thank you very much, Katharine, for enlightening us and sharing with us your insights on this. And I really appreciate the time that you spent, and glad that we could do this on a carbon-neutral basis. So thank you very much. I would love to invite you to the reception afterwards, and that would violate the carbon-neutral component. But nonetheless, we will enjoy it without you and talk about you behind your back. Thank you very much.